14 years. That's not a short career. That's not someone who tried law enforcement for a couple years and moved on. 14 years is a pension. 14 years is relationships. 14 years is knowing people by their first names, knowing who covers for who, knowing how things actually work inside a building that most of us only see from the outside. Brandon Slice spent 14 years at the Lexington County Sheriff's Department. And right now, that same department, the one he spent 14 years inside of, is the one trying to figure out what happened to his wife. I keep turning that over. Not because it proves anything, it doesn't, but because, I don't know. It's the kind of detail that once you hear it, you can't quite stop thinking about. This is Global Crime Files. Everything in this episode is sourced. Ashleigh Banfield's Drop Dead Serious podcast, her direct written exchange with Lexington County Coroner Margaret Fisher, her on-the-record interview with Sergeant Vicky Reigns of the Richland County Sheriff's Department, who you may know from the Netflix series Missing, Dead, or Alive, reporting from Law and Crime, who reached out directly to Brandon Slice. Brandon Slice's own public statements about his professional background, including a promotional video for the Snell Law Firm, where he describes his 14 years with Lexington County. All sourced, all verified. No cause of death has been determined for the body found in Lexington. No individual has been named a suspect or charged with any crime. Brandon Slice has not been accused of anything by law enforcement. This remains an active investigation, and everyone discussed in this episode is presumed innocent unless and until proven otherwise in a court of law. Subscribe to Global Crime Files. Turn on notifications. Let me start with something simple. Something that, on its own, sounds almost like a footnote. Brandon Slice is a private investigator now. He works for a law office, the Snell Law Firm, here in the Lexington area. And in a promotional video for that firm, Brandon introduces himself. I want you to hear how he describes his own background, because it's relevant in a way that, when I first read it, didn't fully register. And then it did. He says, and these are his words, "Prior to being a private investigator, I worked for the Lexington County Sheriff's Department for 14 years. 14 years. Now, on its own, there's nothing wrong with that. People leave law enforcement and become private investigators all the time. It's actually a fairly common career path. Nobody should be suspicious of a person simply because they used to be a cop. But here's the thing. Here's what I keep coming back to. His wife disappeared, and the agency now working to figure out what happened to her. The Lexington Police Department, working alongside the Lexington County Sheriff's Office, eventually handing the death investigation to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. That world, that exact professional world, is the world Brandon spent 14 years inside of. He knows people there. Maybe not everyone, not anymore. Time changes departments. People retire. People transfer. But 14 years builds relationships that don't just evaporate the day you leave. And I think that matters here. Not because it proves wrongdoing. It doesn't. I want to say that clearly, and I'm going to keep saying it throughout this whole video, because I don't want anyone walking away thinking I've concluded something I haven't. But it matters because of what happened next, because of how quickly certain things happen, and because of what a very experienced detective, someone who has spent 4 decades doing exactly this kind of work, said when she looked at the timeline. Let's back up for a second, because I want to set the facts in order the way they actually happened, not the way it's easiest to tell the story. Elena Catherine Moore, 39 years old, a personal trainer in Lexington, South Carolina, signs into a Planet Fitness on the evening of June 11, 2026, walks away from that gym instead of driving, because, as police later confirmed, she didn't have a car with her. Surveillance footage picks her up again 2.5 hours later, walking through a Publix parking lot, heading toward Old Cherokee Road. That's the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The next day, June 12th, her husband, Brandon Slice, reports her missing. Now here's the part that I think deserves real attention, because it's the part that Sergeant Vicky Reigns specifically flagged when Ashleigh Banfield brought her in to talk through this case. Brandon was cleared, quickly. Police said early on, very early on, that he was not considered a person of interest, and he was cleared before a body was even found. Sergeant Reigns has been doing this work for over 4 decades. She's not a commentator who reads headlines and offers takes. She's an actual investigator with the Richland County Sheriff's Department. Richland, by the way, sits right next to Lexington, practically a stone's throw away, her words, and she's the kind of person who spent her career inside missing persons cases, just like this one. And when Ashleigh asked her directly, did it seem fast that police ruled him out? Here's what she said. I'm going to give you her exact reasoning because I think it matters more than my own summary of it. She said that in her experience, you don't usually rule out a spouse until you've gotten the toxicology results back, until the autopsy is complete, until you've actually closed every door, not just the obvious ones. She said the only scenario where you could justify clearing someone that fast is if you had hard evidence, video, a verified location, something that put him definitively somewhere else at the exact moments Elena was seen on camera. If he could be shown to have been nowhere near her, if his alibi was airtight and confirmed independently. And then she said something that I think is the most important sentence in this entire conversation. She said, and I'm quoting her directly, that she's been at this game too long and she's seen proxy crimes being committed, where someone has a perfect alibi because they orchestrated someone else to do something. She wasn't accusing Brandon of that. I want to be really clear about that because it would be easy to clip that sentence out and make it sound like an accusation. It's not. She was explaining a general principle of investigative caution. She was saying, this is why experienced investigators don't rule people out quickly, even when the alibi looks solid. Because alibis can be engineered. Because proximity isn't the only way a person can be connected to something. She said plainly, I wouldn't have ruled him out. Not he did it, not he's guilty. Just, I wouldn't have moved that fast. And there's a second piece of this that I think connects directly back to those 14 years. Law and Crime, a respected outlet that covers exactly this kind of case, reached out to Brandon Slice directly. Not a full interview, a brief conversation, characterized that way specifically. And in that conversation, Brandon told them the police had advised him not to speak to the media, but that when he was allowed to, he'd be interested in talking. Police advised him not to speak to the media. Sergeant Reigns, when Ashleigh brought this up, didn't hesitate. She said that's not typically how this works. She said, and again, I want to give you her actual words because the specificity matters. I would think it would be highly unlikely that the police would say, don't talk about your missing wife. That does seem unusual. She went further. She said in 4 decades, she's never once told a family member not to speak to the media. The opposite, actually. She said departments usually want the spouse in front of the cameras, pleading for tips, asking the public to come forward. Now that's the standard playbook when someone goes missing, especially someone who might be vulnerable. So why would police tell Brandon the opposite? Sergeant Reigns offered a possible explanation, and I think it's worth sitting with slowly because it's not dramatic. It's actually kind of mundane, which somehow makes it more interesting. She said that instruction, don't talk to the media, usually comes from a lawyer, not from police. If you're being told not to comment, normally that's your own attorney protecting you, not law enforcement managing the investigation. So if Brandon is saying the instruction came from police, either something's being misunderstood somewhere in the communication, or something about how he's being treated by this specific department is different from how an average person in his position would typically be treated. I don't know which one it is. Genuinely. I don't think anyone outside that department knows for certain right now. But I keep thinking about those 14 years again. Because here's a thought experiment. And I want to walk through it honestly. Not as a gotcha, just as a way of thinking clearly about this. If a person with zero law enforcement background, a stranger to that building, a stranger to everyone inside it, had a missing wife under these exact circumstances, would police be advising that person not to talk to reporters? Or would they be doing what Sergeant Reigns says is standard, pushing that person in front of every camera they could find, hoping someone, somewhere, recognizes something? I'm not saying I know the answer. I'm saying it's a fair question. It's the question Sergeant Reigns raised. It's the question Ashleigh raised. And it's a question that I think anyone watching this with a clear head would also raise. Now let's talk about the coroner, because this connects to everything else in a way that I didn't expect when I first started looking at this case closely. Margaret Fisher is the Lexington County coroner. Ashleigh Banfield reached her directly, not through a press conference, through a written exchange, question and answer, back and forth. And what Fisher said is, I think, one of the most carefully worded statements in this entire case. She wrote, and I want to read this slowly because every word is doing something specific. I'm not sure if foul play is suspected, as that would be a law enforcement question at this point. And from my experience perspective, I could not tell. Nothing obvious at that point. Nothing obvious at that point. Think about what that actually means in practice. If someone had been shot, if someone had been stabbed, if there had been severe blunt force trauma, the kind you can see without an autopsy table in front of you, a coroner with real field experience would typically be able to say so, even informally, even off the record in a written exchange like this one. She didn't say that. She said nothing was obvious, which leaves open a different category of possibilities entirely. Things that don't announce themselves on the surface. Asphyxiation, in certain conditions, doesn't always leave visible bruising, especially if a body has been outdoors in South Carolina heat for the better part of a week, and decomposition has begun to set in. Sergeant Reigns actually walked through this specifically. She said that during an autopsy, even with external decomposition, the hyoid bone, a fragile bone in the neck, can still reveal whether strangulation occurred. It's something you can't always see from the outside, but something a medical examiner can often determine once they're actually doing the work. There's also the possibility of an overdose, a medication issue, something toxicological rather than traumatic. And Sergeant Reigns raised that specifically too, tying it back to something we already know, that Elena had reportedly, according to multiple sourced individuals close to her, recently been released from a mental health facility before she disappeared. If she was on medication, if something happened with that medication, intentionally or not. That's a version of the story that doesn't require anyone to have done anything to her at all. That's a real possibility. I want to hold space for that because it would be its own kind of tragedy, and it deserves to be treated with exactly as much seriousness as any other explanation. But toxicology results, according to Sergeant Reigns, typically take a couple of weeks in South Carolina. So whatever this turns out to be, we're not getting that answer fast. Now, I want to come back to something, because I think it's actually the through line connecting all of this. Sergeant Reigns made a point that I haven't heard anyone else articulate quite this clearly. She said that any time a woman goes missing, the people closest to her, and she specifically named spouses first, are always the first people investigators have to look at seriously. Not because they're assumed guilty, because statistically, historically, across decades of cases just like this one, that's where the answers most often live. She said you start at the center and you move outward. You rule people out methodically. You don't skip steps. And in this case, the center, the husband, was cleared almost instantly, before remains were even found, before an autopsy, before toxicology, before anyone could possibly know what actually happened to Elena. I keep asking myself why. And I don't have a clean answer. I have a 14-year career inside the exact department now circling this case. I have an unusual instruction not to speak to media that nobody seems able to explain in a way that matches how these things typically work. I have a coroner saying nothing is obvious, which means this case is going to live or die, pun not intended, genuinely not intended, on toxicology results that are still weeks away. What I don't have is proof of anything. And I want to be honest about that, because this audience deserves honesty more than it deserves a tidy conclusion. There's something else Sergeant Reigns said that I haven't been able to shake. She talked about the doorbell camera footage. The moment, a week before Elena disappeared, when she showed up confused at a stranger's door, then was found an hour later going through a neighbor's packages, telling the homeowner, "Honestly, I don't know," when asked what she was doing. Sergeant Reigns said something simple about that. She said if more people had known what was actually going on with Elena, if her mental health situation had been more visible to the people around her in that moment, rather than something private that nobody outside her closest circle understood, maybe someone would have called for help instead of just walking away from a strange but not alarming interaction. She said, and I think this is worth sitting with for a second, we see people in distress on the street regularly, and either for our own safety or just because we don't want to intrude on someone's privacy, we let it go unchecked. That's not a statement about Brandon. That's not a statement about police. That's a statement about all of us, honestly, about how a community can watch warning signs pass by in real time and not fully understand what they're looking at until it's too late to act on it. I think about Elena's friends in this, the people who, after she disappeared, started piecing together fragments. She'd been in a facility. She'd seemed disoriented. Maybe she and Brandon had been having problems. Maybe she wasn't even staying with him in the weeks before she vanished. Sergeant Reigns confirmed she'd heard some of that too through mutual connections in the community. Though she was careful to say you have to verify every piece of that kind of secondhand information before you can treat it as fact. That's the responsible way to handle rumor. Acknowledge it exists. Don't pretend you don't hear it. But don't repeat it as confirmed truth either. So where does that leave us? A man with 14 years inside the department now investigating his missing wife's death. A police instruction not to talk to media that an experienced detective says doesn't match how this usually works. A coroner who says nothing about the body is obvious, which keeps every possibility on the table, including ones that don't involve anyone hurting Elena at all. And toxicology results that are still weeks away from telling us anything close to the truth. I don't think anyone watching this wants me to hand them a conclusion right now, because there isn't an honest one to give. What I think this audience wants What I think Elena deserves is for someone to lay out exactly what's known, exactly what's been said on the record by people with real expertise, and exactly where the genuine, unresolved questions still sit. Those questions are real. Sergeant Vicky Reigns raised them, not me. A detective with 4 decades of experience, someone who has spent her career inside exactly this kind of case, looked at this timeline and said, "I wouldn't have done it this way. That's not nothing. That's also not proof. It's the space this case is sitting in right now. Uncomfortable, unresolved, waiting on lab results that won't arrive for weeks." Elena Catherine Moore was 39 years old. She trained people's bodies for a living. She poured drinks. She filled prescriptions at a CVS counter. She was, by every account from people who actually knew her, visible, active, engaged in her community, which is exactly why the silence and confusion in her final days stood out so sharply to everyone who loved her. She deserves answers that are actually true, not the fastest ones, not the most convenient ones. The true ones, whatever they turn out to be and however long they take to arrive. If you have any information related to this case, please contact the Lexington Police Department or the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division directly. Tip information is linked in the description below. No cause of death has been determined. No individual has been named a suspect or charged with any crime. Brandon Slice has not been accused of anything by law enforcement, and he is the person who reported Elena missing. This remains an active investigation, and everyone discussed in this episode is presumed innocent unless and until proven otherwise in a court of law. This is Global Crime Files. Every victim deserves the truth. Every story deserves to be told.